With Sony and Microsoft having embraced putting their games on as many platforms as they can, along with the existence of Steam, it would seem like the era of games being exclusive to certain platforms is a thing of the past. We're headed for a future where every game is on every platform. That's a win for consumers, and they won't be required to invest in multiple platforms to play their favorite games. There's one stubborn company who hasn't gotten the memo. Obviously, I'm talking about Nintendo. These antiquated knuckleheads refuse to budge on the idea of keeping their games on their hardware. Why won't they get with the times? The console is dead, and so is the idea of leaving games stranded on those consoles. Or is it just that the competition can't hack it? Sony and Microsoft want to be like Nintendo. They want to sell you their consoles and their games on that console. They just can't do it. They can't do what Nintendo does. Their move to third party is not them dropping everything they're doing and riding the new wave of gaming. They want to ride Nintendo's wave, but they keep wiping out. Realizing they didn't have the IP muscle to bring value to their consoles, they were forced to make the only decision they could make: put their games everywhere. Many will tell you Microsoft and Sony are these altruistic companies who care about the consumer and wanting to make their games available to any platform, when truthfully, they're forced to do this because of their own failures. But is exclusivity dead? How can it be dead when Nintendo is winning because of the very thing people say is dead? Sony and Microsoft don't have the IPs to make it work. The PS1 and the PS2 were carried by third-party games. The PS4 was carried by first-party titles from Sony Studios, but it's proven difficult to follow many of these up due to how much money it costs to make those games. Many have commented on how expensive game development has become. Not for Nintendo. They don't make expensive games, and they don't have to share the pot with anyone because these are their own games. Nintendo has been able to survive third-party studios not putting their flagship games on their platform because Nintendo consoles have never been carried by third-party games. The NES was the start of many classic video game series like Mega Man, Castlevania, Ninja Gaiden, Contra, and many others. None of these games sold anywhere near as well as Mario or even Zelda. The games which dominated sales on any of Nintendo's systems has always been their own games. Sony can't reach into their retro library because they don't have a retro library. All those games people love from the PS1 and 2 aren't their games. It's why their attempt at copying Nintendo with the PS1 Classic fell flat. We're seeing the unfortunate end result of your most iconic consoles being carried by games that aren't yours. It worked when Final Fantasy VII and X were only on PlayStation consoles, but those games no longer bring value to your platform when they can be played anywhere. Sony does have killer apps that would sell well if they made new installments for them. Spider-Man, God of War, Horizon, Last of Us, Uncharted. The problem is, these games are way too expensive to make, and they would require live service elements to make the money back from development. Again, Nintendo don't have them problems. They don't have $100 million budgets for their iconic franchises, selling tens of millions at full price. Sony's made some bad investments, and many of those chickens have come home to roost. They don't have a retro library to capitalize on, and continuing their most successful franchises won't net them the return on investment they're looking for. People want Sony to go back to the old days of the PS1 and PS2. Newsflash, that means Sony goes back to exclusive games. The fact that you can only play games like Tekken, Tomb Raider, and Crash Bandicoot on a PlayStation was what gave it the victory over Nintendo and Sega. If those games were multi-platform, and they could have been if Nintendo used CDs for the 64, the 64 dog walks the PS1 because it would have all those games plus Nintendo's in-house and first-party exclusive games. But remember, exclusivity is bad, despite the fact it's the reason PlayStation was able to get a foothold in the industry in the first place. Listen, I'm not here to say every company needs to go back to an exclusivity model. What Microsoft is doing is working and turning their hardware into one option among many to have access to their software. Everyone doesn't have to do things the same way. Exclusivity didn't work for Microsoft, so they went a different route, and it's been good for them, and it will be good for consumers. Nintendo has its own strategy that works for them. It works because all those iconic games and IPs, which have been among the most successful games in the industry in their respective categories, are all made and or owned by Nintendo. Exclusivity and non-exclusivity can coexist. There's more than one way to skin a cat, as the saying goes. Ponies can feel on themselves for that 75 million in hardware sales until they get carpal tunnel. Meanwhile, studios and projects are being shut down, people are getting laid off, live service offerings are crashing and burning, and their exclusive development partners are headed to PC. That's not a sign of a healthy gaming platform. Sony will have to copy Microsoft because they can't copy Nintendo. They don't have a choice. Sony has to drop exclusivity, not because it's dead, but because it doesn't work for them. Stop trying to beat Nintendo at their own game and beat Nintendo at your own game. That's what Nintendo did and has done. Nintendo doesn't follow, they lead. They do their own thing and they win. Microsoft is also doing their own thing to great success. Sony needs to figure it out and stop depending on internet weirdos gaslighting everyone into thinking Sony shit doesn't stink. At the end of the day, none of these companies are doing anything they're doing for your benefit. They're not trying to do right by you. They're trying to figure out the best way to separate you from your money. What the most successful companies tend to understand, however, is the best way to make money and have longevity in making money is to make sure the person who invests in your product is satisfied with their purchase and doesn't feel they somehow got screwed over. I don't consider that altruism. That's just good business. I say this because people will ask, but is exclusivity better for consumers? None of these companies care about consumers. That's the point. They only care about their bottom line. But if you want to run a sustainably successful business, you're going to have to cut a deal with the customer. Take-Two is going to attempt extortion on gamers by selling Grand Theft Auto 6 at $100. That game needs to fail for the sanctity of gaming. Take-Two is testing the market to see what they will bear. This is not just about GTA 6. This is an attempt to raise the pricing threshold for the entire industry. If this game is successful at that price, every marquee game will be $100. This is not the timeline you want to live in, so you better let them know by voting with your dollar, or lack thereof. You do not want the next Spider-Man and God of War game to be $100. But I digress. Ultimately, companies aren't going to use an exclusivity model because it requires highly successful and compelling IPs to get people to invest, and most companies don't have that. Sony and Microsoft aren't game development studios like Nintendo is, and buying up wildly successful IPs like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto costs a ton of money. Nintendo is in a unique position to make exclusivity work for them because of the way they have built their platform over the course of their video game history around their own games. Games being everywhere will be par for the course going forward for everyone not named Nintendo.